stage of our session. We have the pleasure to have with us online Professor Norman Wirsba, who is a professor of Christian theology and a senior fellow. He has the seat of the Gilbert T. Road, and he's also a senior fellow at the Kennan Institute of Ethics at Duke University. His research and teaching interests are at the intersection of theology, philosophy, ecology, and environmental studies. He has written a lot of books, amongst them one about the relationship between faith and food, and his speech is titled Thinking Theologically About Food, Why It Matters in Our Anthropocene World.
All right, thank you so much. It's very good to be with you. I wish I could be there in person, but it's a great distance and it's not possible. So I would like to talk a little bit about how we might think theologically about food. And, you've heard that I wrote a book called Food and Faith, A Theology of Eating, where I'll go into much more detail into some of the things that I'll be talking about today with you. And I want to focus in particular about why the Anthropocene is such an important framing for the way we think both about food and also how we think theologically about food. And I'll start by saying that we can speak of the Anthropocene in varying ways. As you just heard, it is a contested term. And Earth system scientists have suggested that it's important for us to find what they call the golden spike, which will be some geologically based record for when we see a decisive shift in the way the planet behaves. And some have gone to mercantile capitalism in the 17th and 18th centuries, where we see the expansion of colonial trade, imperial power. Some have said we really should look to the Industrial Revolution, in particular, the production of energy through the burning of coal, which of course puts an amount of CO2 into the atmosphere. But another version of the Anthropocene that has gained considerable traction is called the Great Acceleration, which is the period shortly after the Second World War and continuing in today. And the Great Acceleration is marked by not just the mass production, but also the mass consumption of a great many consumer goods. And this is reflected, obviously, in the drawdown of so many natural resources, the drawdown of water, certainly the drawdown of soil fertility. I, in this presentation, will adopt the Great Acceleration as the framing because that is a framing which I think has had a very profound impact on the way we think about food and farming in particular. We can say that the Anthropocene coincides with a revolution in agricultural practice, and I would say even in our thinking about what we believe food to be. And there are many indicators of this. The first, of course, would be that we see the mechanization of agriculture happening after the Second World War, primarily in one of the very great changes, which is to say that machinery of varying kinds, tractors, combines, balers, you name it, these machines become the dominant means by which agricultural work is now performed. And this is of such great significance because you have to think not only about the production of these machines, but then also the running of these machines, all of which is heavily dependent upon the combustion of oil and gas, but then also significantly in the production of the machines themselves, tremendous amounts of energy and steel and rubber and so forth are used to produce these implements. This is a wholesale transformation in the way farmers think about the work that they do. And you can see this simply by doing historical work around farming communities that were previously sort of powered by animals versus farms that are powered by tractors or machines. A second major revolution that is reflected in this transformation is the reduction of farms, or the recasting perhaps of farms as factories. The model for this way of thinking really begins in the 1920s, so slightly before the Second World War, but it is instantiated primarily because production of other goods, particularly the automobile, comes to be characterized in terms of the factory and line production, which is to produce as many vehicles as quickly as possible. Now, this is significant for the way we think about farms, because now farms are characterized as interchangeable parts that can be modified, that can be accelerated, that can be engineered to maximize productivity. And we should be very clear that this technique of reducing farms to factories resulted in tremendous increases in the yields of primary crops like wheat, barley, grains, alfalfa, corn, cotton, and so forth. But what happens with this transformation of farms into factories is a recasting of the life on the farm into mechanisms. And this can take many, many different forms, right? One of the most basic that we come to see is a genetic engineering of plant and animal life. Now, I'm not opposed to all genetic engineering, but what is very clear is that the genetic engineering that is performed now in our fields and in our farm sites are not geared toward the increase of nutritious food as they are to increase the overall productivity. So, for instance, if we think about the use of poisons like Roundup, which is used to control weeds in, say, wheat applications, the point of developing Roundup was to control weeds, but it was also to make sure that the plants that are grown with the application of Roundup now can withstand this poison. And it's a question about whether or not these poisons are making their way into our food systems. And it's very clear that they are. And so there are real health impacts that are needing to be discussed when thinking about the use of these toxins. I remember several years ago meeting engineers who were working on these herbicides to control weed populations. And I asked them what is going to happen, because we know that plants develop resistance or tolerance for these weeds. And so the herbicides need to become ever more toxic. And the engineer was very clear and said, well, the weeds are going to win because we're going to continue to apply more and more herbicides that are more and more toxic. One of the promises that was made early on when these herbicides were invented is that we would greatly reduce the need for them over time. And what we have seen is not a reduction of their use, but even the expansion of their use. So for instance, now Roundup is used to bring grain to a quicker maturity. Now, in the space of animals, this is also quite concerning. So, for instance, chickens, which I'm assuming several of you know about, will take roughly 90 days to get to full weight, slaughter weight. But from a productivity perspective, that is a length of time that should be shortened so that we can have more cycles of chicken production. And so chickens have been engineered and then submitted to a nutrition or feeding regimen that brings them to slaughter weight in 55 days rather than 90, which from a financial point of view makes a great deal of sense. But from the perspective of a chicken, you would have to say this is not a very good way to think about chicken life, because we know that their lives are quite miserable. And we know that the meat that is produced is also not of the highest quality. So this is just two examples in the plant and animal realm where we see how the characterization and the reduction of living farming systems to machines and to factories represents a revolution. What you have to understand is that through most of human history, food was understood to be a biological reality that was powered through sunshine and muscle. That has been evaporated because now food is a financial product and it is powered by fossil fuels. And that's a completely new way of thinking about the world that we're in, but also a new way in which people now relate to the food that they eat. So one of the ways to characterize the food itself now is to say that rather than being a biological reality, it registers as a unit of production. The unit of production language is important because what it means is that food itself, along with the farming processes that generate this food, are subject to calculations around efficiency, maximum yield, and maximum profitability. And if those become the determining mechanisms for how we think about food, we should understand that this is a radically different way of thinking about what food actually is. And we'll get to another way of framing what food is shortly. The second thing that I think is so important is to note that human beings now, as the consumers of food, are understood primarily as units of consumption. And this is why food companies spend billions of dollars every year advertising their food products, because what's so important is to entice eaters to buy their product. Because if you think that on average in a grocery store, somewhere between 40 and 60,000 food products are available, the big question from a food company perspective is how do you get people to buy your product as opposed to someone else's? And so a tremendous amount of money is spent to try to convince eaters to buy their product. And this is now a highly scientific enterprise because we know that foods can be alluring or made more alluring by manipulating things like salt, sweetness, and fat content in the food. And so we're seeing that many of the food products that are being presented and advertised to eaters have almost nothing to do with their nutritional value. In fact, we know that many of these industrial diets that are being promoted are amongst the most unhealthy in the history of the world. And if you go into a grocery store and you go into the middle aisles, what you discover is that much of the packaging, when you read the ingredients list, it's almost impossible to discern any attachment of that food to things that come out of the ground. Now, the logic of the unit of consumption way of thinking about eaters is that you want to maximize not just them buying your product, you also want to maximize how much of the product they will eat, because revenue, right, profitability will grow up insofar as eaters consume more. And so the logic of this way of thinking, where food is a unit of production and eaters are units of consumption, is to design a food that on principle is indigestible. And that's exactly what has been invented most recently, where food companies are designing foods that taste very good in your mouth, right? They stimulate your desire for salty, sweet, fat kinds of food, but they cannot be digested by your body. And so they pass through your body, which means that your hunger is not satisfied, which means that you can continue to eat more. And this is, we might call it the capitalist dream, to design a food that has almost no trace in natural things, then sold to consumers who will not digest it, but will continue to have to pay for it. Now, I've spent some time describing what has happened to our food and farming systems in the last several decades. And I think it's important to say that when we describe food as a commodity, we're not just saying that it has this new designation, because how we name things in the world, what we believe them to be, is of profound significance when we figure out how should we relate to this food. So for instance, to give you just a slight small example, imagine that I'm holding a plant and I say that it's a flower. Immediately, your response will be, this is beautiful. It is something I would like to behold, to come close to smell and admire. But now, what if I say that, no, this plant is not a flower, it's actually a weed? The minute you say that this plant is a weed rather than the flower, your desire no longer is to behold it, it is to kill it, to eradicate it, because weeds get in the way of maximizing the plant you want to grow. But now imagine that I say, no, this plant is not a flower or a weed, it's actually a tomato plant in bloom. Now you're going to think not just to behold it or to kill it, you're going to think that if I take care of this plant, What will happen is in the space of several weeks, I will be able to enjoy tomatoes. But for that to happen, I need to take care of it, right? I need to sucker it, I need to tie it, and so forth. So here are three namings of food that evoke in us dramatically different postures and responses to it. So if we name food a commodity, it's just a product. The question is, what's the relationship we're going to have to it? And the most obvious one, which you can discern just by looking at people in grocery stores, is everybody is concerned mostly about having food that is cheap and food that is convenient and food that is copious in its amount and availability. And what's become very clear is that our desire for cheap and convenient food has done tremendous damage to our lands, to our waters, to plant and animal life, and most certainly also to the worlds of agricultural workers. Because as we are seeing all around the world, farmers are not being paid properly for the work that they do, and they're being abused and degraded. And they are amongst some of the most vulnerable populations in the workforce today. So thinking about food as a product, I want to suggest is a great error because now we submit the whole of food and farming systems to the logics of efficiency, maximum productivity, and maximum profitability. So now, what would a theological naming of food be? If food is not a commodity, what would be a better way to describe food? And what I want to suggest to you is that food is God's love made nutritious and delicious. Now, I know this is a strange way to speak about food, right? You don't hear grocery managers talking about food as God's love made nutritious. But I think in our ordinary experience, this is actually borne out. So, for instance, when somebody invites you to their home for a meal and they present the food to you, the food is a declaration of their care and their love for you. And so it's not at all silly to suggest that in the creation of the world, a creation in which God creates creatures who must eat to live, and then creates a world that is populated with many, many delicious foods. This is, in fact, God's first self-revelation as the God of love. We could imagine God creating a world in which no creature needed to eat. And in some respects, that would be a welcome way of imagining the world, because for people who have any direct connection with the raising of animals or the growing of food, you know that for you to eat, others have to die. Even if you're a vegetarian eater, eating involves us in the death of others. There is no eating apart from the death of others. And that means eating, which is the means of life, is carried on through the processes of dying. This is serious. But I think it's also significant that God chose to create in this manner because eating is at the same time the most intimate way that we have of being with one another. Eating draws us into the world. It stitches us into biophysical, geochemical, ecological processes that are absolutely essential for what we could call a life of intimacy. And all of this is God's way of communicating that I desire not only for you to be fed, but also to experience the delight of food that is flavorful and delicious. So rather than thinking about food as a product, I want you to think about food as God's love made delectable. Because we should be astounded by the fact that God creates a world that can taste so very, very good. And having been to Greece, I know you have very, very tasty and delicious food. So that's one feature, I think, a renaming of food, which I think ought to put in us a new posture with respect to the food and ought to institute a new set of ethical relationships with the food and with the farms. Secondly, I want to say that food is a sacred gift, right? Gifts are different than products. because what products communicate is a world in which transaction rules the kinds of relationships we have with it. When food is simply a product, what we worry about is the price, and we can haggle about the price and we can make a deal. But as soon as the money exchanges hands, the deal is over and we walk away. But when we say food is a sacred gift, right? A gift communicates not a transactional world or a contractual world. A gift communicates a covenantal world, a world in which while we exchange, we don't simply walk away from each other, because in the giving of gifts, we communicate our desire to be involved in the well-being, the welfare of others. And so gift worlds communicate a moral economy in which we have obligations, continuing responsibilities, even after the transfer of the gift. So that's very important to have in mind. I think secondly, about gifts, is so important is that we don't control them. We don't own them. We don't get to determine the gift, when it comes, how it comes. And this is something I think that is also borne out in our experience. If you are yourself a grower of food, you can do everything right, but still realize that in the end, whether or not there will be life, right? Germination, growth, fruit, right? All of these things are well beyond your control. Weather can intervene, pests can intervene, death can intervene. So many things can make it such that food is not going to be within your control. And that ought to inculcate in us a better posture of receptivity. And so the question of how we receive a gift, how do we work with a gift, becomes profoundly important. And the way I would describe it is to say that we're really dealing with a fundamentally different kind of anthropology than the kind of anthropology that we find, say, in market economics or in neoliberal economics, in which purchasers of food are solitary, they're captains of their own destiny. This is not at all the characterization, because when you live within a world that is saturated by gift upon gift, you realize that you live only because of your openness and receptivity to gifts. And then the most important thing is for you then to pass on gifts to others. So you think of yourself now not as an isolated, self-standing, maximizing kind of being. You understand yourself to be more like a conduit for the grace and blessings that are circulating around you all the time. And your position as a human being now is to witness to the gifts that you receive, that you depend upon. And in your witness, express gratitude for the gifts, but also generosity. The true mark of gratitude is not simply that we say thank you. The true mark of gratitude is when we take our thank you and transform it into the giving of gifts to others as well. Because a world in which we withhold generosity becomes a very dark and stark world indeed. So rather than thinking about food as a product, which is precisely what an Anthropocene framing has done, it's made everything in the world into a product or a commodity that is to be maximized in its purchase. We are instead to think about food as God's love made delicious, nutritious, delectable. That is an exhibition of God's love, but also God's way of being, which is the way of receiving, sharing, giving again, witnessing to the goodness and beauty of the world. As a created good, food didn't have to exist. We don't have to exist. This is one of the fundamental aspects of any doctrine of creation. The world is contingent. And so the fact that it exists is because of a divine intention that says it is good and beautiful, and I would say delicious, that it does exist. Practically speaking, what would this mean? I think many things, but I'll just suggest three. Where I live, there is a phenomenon called community-supported agriculture, where community members work with area farmers to make sure that area farmers have the money they need to grow but then the farmers provide the food to the community members. In this way, you create a relationship, because one of the struggles that farmers have is that they don't know if they will have people buying what they grow. So community supported agriculture has become quite popular. I would like to suggest that we invigorate church supported agriculture. And by this, what I mean is that congregations, faith communities of many, many kinds, decide to partner with area farmers, because many farmers find themselves in a situation where they don't want to grow simply for a commodities market, because they know that they'll often abuse the animals, abuse the fields, poison their waters. And so for them to know that a church community is guaranteeing them a source of income, and they have a guaranteed source of where their food is going to go, food that they will now grow in ways that are more nutritious, more life honoring, more land and water preserving, more humane to animals, for instance, right? This becomes a wonderful sort of relationship. Secondly, I think we should all acknowledge the fact that churches own a tremendous amount of land in the world, both in rural regions, but also in urban centers. This is so important because, as we know, the price of land has shot up everywhere, such that young people who want to farm simply are unable to do that because they can't even consider paying the price that land now demands. Right? When I was farming very, very early on in my life and we wanted to buy more land, the price of land in the 1980s was such that you could farm it your whole life and never pay back the loan. That has only increased. And so for churches to give some of their land to people who want to grow food, that would be an incredible witness, not only to creating food security in communities that are desperate for good, nutritious food, but one of the things that we know is that when we grow food in community, we also build the community, right? The community is often the most important harvest that comes out of a community garden or farming project. And then thirdly, I would like to recommend that churches become actual sites for food security. And that can take many, many different forms. But one of them would be that congregations use their facilities as sites through which to navigate the circulation of food through the community, working with schools, for instance, or working with hospitals to provide students or to provide patients nutritious points of food, or to give farmers markets a location in which they can do their work, right? There are many things that congregations can do to help with food security in their neighborhoods. And I don't want to suggest only one thing, because each community has different potential, because it has different people, has different histories. And so what I recommend is that church communities, congregations, begin talking about what can they do in their space to better facilitate that nobody goes hungry, because it is an affront to God's goodness and desire for this world that every person, every creature be fed. In fact, the withholding of food is a withholding of God's love, particularly if we see food to be God's love made nutritious and delicious. So thank you.
Ευχαριστούμε πολύ τον καθηγητή Νόρμαν Βίρτσπα. Νομίζω ότι η παρουσίαση...
Thank you, Norman. I think it was a delightful presentation, a delicious also. He talked about the aspects of the commoditization of food globally. But at the same time, he gave a very fresh theological perspective on how food can be consumed, and he offered practical tips on how church can play an important role in local communities in relation to agricultural production. And I think this can indeed become the vision of local church communities outside the US. This is something that can be relevant to Greece as well, because indeed church has wide areas of land and it can use it in the way suggested in cooperation with local communities. There might be some examples, but that's not the most common case in Greece. There is a question from Mr. Zdroulias to the speaker. Mr. Visba, congratulations. You talk about a dimension of food, but before talking about food, because all of us use food, but I will stick to what you said. You said that farms turned into factories. This might be the case in the US, but if you go to 70 years ago in Greece or in Europe, when we stopped using horses for agricultural production, and gradually Europe and Greece started to mechanize agricultural production, then we started using fertilizers. When I was young, I remember the fertilizers were very hard and we had some rocks to break them. Then we started using herbicides, but before that, farms were industrialized for the very simple reason that the European Union gave large subsidies to the agricultural population in order to purchase such machinery. Tragic mistakes were made. So when a farmer with 2 hectares or 3 hectares of land, so very small plots, because that's the case in Greece, the farms are very small. There are not wide areas of land that belong to the same person. So farmers were able to purchase tractors that were not needed for this small plot of land. So farmers started to spend much more than the crops produced. For example, the cost to produce wheat and grain, you spend 10 in order to purchase your own bread. You talked about Roundup. There is also Glean. My father used to say that Glean destroyed us because it remained on Earth for 3 years after its use. But there was also a piece of legislation that was to withdraw these very strong pesticides and herbicides. But unfortunately, here in Greece and in the EU, they arrive from third countries when there are no such controls. That's the harsh truth. You talked about the devaluation of the agricultural population. I think the agricultural population and agricultural produce is blessed by church, both the oil and the bread. But we have to do something about that to change this situation. The theological name of food, that was very important. All the monks in the Mount Athos, they say that wine is food as well. So monks very often talk using different names about food. They consider everything to be food and not a commodity. Yes, indeed, Greece has delicious food, and food is a gift of God. But how do we approach this gift from God? A few days ago, I asked from an old lady to tell me how bread is made to the traditional method. And they used to do that with very much love. Today, that's not the case anymore. We just use machinery to eat some bread. We use soft wheat from Ukraine, although in Thessaly, our region, there are traditional hard wheat crops that are very nutritious. You also said, I don't know whether you know that under the EU law, starting from 2014, we are not allowed to have our own personal gardens. with 2 chickens, 2 sheep. So we had when we were very young this home economy that is not allowed under the current legislation anymore. Cities just consume, they don't produce anything. It's the countryside that produces. But what happens? The US is a huge country. We may be talking about different areas. In Greece, we have very small farms, very small plots of land, and the politicians do not advocate for Greek farmers.
Yeah, so there's
So
a
what
lot.
are we going to do now?
Yeah,
That's a big question.
it is a very big question, and I think I would say that there isn't one answer to it because every part of the world has its unique challenges and unique opportunities. So what's happening in the EU, for instance, is different than a lot of what's happening in the United States. I also recognize that there are international trade agreements that will often dictate what people can do on their own land, right? So that we have often poor countries growing for export because they're having to service the debt of the nation, growing commodities for American markets rather than growing food for their own communities. So this is an example of how international trade agreements will have tremendous impacts on what people can grow in their communities. And I did not know about the fact that the EU prohibits homegrown food. That's a greatly disturbing thing to learn about. I think what's also important to say is that there are places where there is still small scale production that has resisted. There is regenerative agriculture that is growing in different parts of the world. But in terms of the percentage of the amount of food grown around the world, there's no question that the dominant system is the one that I described, which depends upon the reduction of food to product and land, animals, plants to a commodity. And I think one of the things that faith communities can do is they can be the kind of witness that would say that we need to reject the framing of food as a commodity, because food is not that. It is, in fact, an expression of love, God's love for us, but also our love for each other. And that food, nutritious food, ought to be something like a basic human right. And if faith communities, I mean, not just Christians, but also Buddhists and Muslims and Jews and so many others who also have a conception of food as a sacred gift, if faith communities were to begin to argue in the political sphere that we need to recast food as a sacred gift to be shared, to be received with gratitude and humility, right? That would be a tremendous witness in the world. But I recognize that that's a difficult thing to accomplish because I will even say that many of my Christian friends, they are deeply puzzled about why I care about food as a theological concern, because they argue that it's not. They would say the only thing that matters is whether the food is cheap or convenient. And that's a tragedy. It's a failure, I think, of our theological imaginations that we've not been able to communicate to each other how much food is, in fact, a gift from God.
Υπάρχει άλλη ερώτηση? Πολλές βλέπω. Σύντομα όμως παρακαλώ.
There are other questions, yes.
I too am an eco-theologian who works in food. I'm also from the States. I have a quick question. What would you respond to a critic who said, I agree with much of what you said, and I make similar arguments. What would you say to a critic who says, what about the fact that humans have been essentially genetically engineering food through artificial selection for centuries? What's the difference between what was going on then and now? I know you highlighted some of the production side, but how would you respond to that critic? Because they're out there.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah. I don't doubt that they're out there. I've heard them. They've come to me to voice these criticisms as well. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that the kinds of genetic modification that you have historically is of a fundamentally different kind. So, for instance, what you'll see if you go to, say, Central America, birthplace of potatoes, We know that farmers did genetic modification through the selection of particular strains of potatoes that grow in a particular region better than other potatoes. And so you have varieties that are specific to a valley, for instance. And so it's not surprising that if you go to Central America, you'll have thousands of different kinds of potatoes. And what do we have in an industrial system which genetically modifies the farming landscape and the potato? You have now the growth of the russet potato, which has to be of a particular size, roughly this big around, and is genetically modified not for nutrition, not for adaptability to an ecological system, but you have it genetically designed so that you could have uniform French fries. And this is because McDonald's wants the potatoes to be uniform in size so that they can go into a machinery that will then slice them, and then be able to, cook them, because people want uniform size French fries. Nutritional value doesn't matter. Ecological resilience doesn't matter. Even the heritage of the community that grows them does not matter. This is a system where the modification is entirely devoted to profitability, right? So that's a different way of thinking about food. And the question is, does it matter? Well, it clearly does, because a potato that is uniquely suited to fit within an ecosystem will be a benefit to the ecosystem, just as the ecosystem is a benefit to it. But if you look at the farming landscapes that now russet potatoes are grown in, they look like lunar landscapes because they have been thoroughly poisoned so that there will be no weeds. But this is soil that is basically not soil, it's dead. And so the only way you can grow these potatoes now is to continually add nutrients through the application of, water systems that have all these nutrients that are added. So the nutritional profile of potato is dramatically degraded with this system. And I would say the same thing with animals, right? Animals were bred in all sorts of ways to highlight particular traits. And what we have now are animals that are bred not for traits that are good for the animals or good for the communities in which they're raised, but they're bred simply so that they can be machines that maximize yield. So for instance, if you think about a dairy cow, right? Dairy cows, they can produce milk. They have been for generations. They've been doing this, hundreds of years. But what we have now is we have Holstein cows that are producing gallons of milk every day, and they're treated as machines, which means their life expectancy is never more than 2 years, because they're thoroughly exhausted and degraded, assaulted, you might even say, by the genetic design that is make the cow maximum milk production machine. And so this, what we might call the sanctity or the integrity of the life, has just been thrown out the window, because all that matters is that you get as much milk as you can and as quickly as you can. So the logic of maximum profitability, maximum productivity, degrades the life systems in which these genetic modifications are happening. It's a very different process than simply selecting over time, over multiple generations, strains of plants or animals that are going to be much better suited to a community and its region.
Τι ακόμα ερωτήσεις?
Questions? So, starting from your previous remark on how communities of faith have to declare and find a new relationship with food, I have to say that we have to go back to the root of the problem. In my opinion, capitalism constructed a different concept of time. We are constantly out of time. The day is not enough. The hours are not enough. And now our relationship with food is linked with that people are also very tired, that do not want to spend time into growing food. They are exhausted. Even in Greece, which cannot be compared to the States, but at least after the pandemic, there is an increase of the people that order food delivery every day, not just in special occasions. They even order coffee with a delivery. They cannot care to make their own coffee. So we have to go back to discuss reducing the working hours. I don't know. We have to rethink the whole life.
I think that's the very important insight that you bring to the table. For sure, capitalism changes the way we think about time. And I think more recently, something like the financialization of capital that's happened in the most recent decades has made the pressures that you're describing even more intense. And so you're absolutely right to say that most people now go through life thoroughly exhausted because they don't have time, because they don't have money. And so much of what they're doing. Now, I know it's complicated. There's many more things that we should be talking about than just that people are being worked to death. I think there's also the understanding that you see in people that their lives have become intolerably dull and boring. And so spending so much time looking for stimulation when what we really want in life is transformation. And we see this through social media platforms, for instance, where people are spending a great amount of time on these kinds of devices because they're looking for intimacy, they're looking for connection. And food, strangely or not strangely, depending on who you are, food is the place of intimacy, right? Think about how much time people spend when they care about the eating and they care about the people they're eating with. They don't do a fast food drive-through. They sit together, they cook together, they spend time enjoying the meal, enjoying each other's company, right? The word companion is with bread, companis, right? So what we have here, I think, is an important insight about how capitalism, especially more recent forms of capitalism, create not just a new relationship to land, but a new relationship to time, which you're absolutely right to point out. And so it's something that I think we would need to talk about with our faith communities. And in this particular case, I would really emphasize the importance of the Sabbath as a way of describing, framing the whole question of what time is, because the Sabbath is fundamentally a teaching about what it's all for. And what the Sabbath teaches, I believe, is that God creates the world for delight, and that God's own first Shabbat is God coming into the presence of all this love now made material, made delicious, so as to enjoy and rest in it.
Και μια τελευταία ερώτηση, James.
First of all, thank you very, very much for your wonderful presentation. My brother, who's not a Christian, has been saying these things to me for many, many years now. And my question is a practical one. Is I'm sure there are many young, especially young, but not necessarily only young people. There are people who, because of the way that cities are and people's working lives are these days, they simply don't have time to prepare and share food the way you wonderfully suggested. I remember my own experiences of visiting Mount Athos as a pilgrim, and the food tastes so delicious there because it's made and presented with love for the people for the pilgrims. But thinking very, very practically, the people's lives in big cities, that they have so little time. A lot of people don't even take the trouble to learn to cook because they feel they don't have time. Mm-hmm. So what practical suggestions could you offer for people who find themselves in that sort of category, like trying to implement, your wonderful ideas, but for people who have these practical concerns?
Yeah. No, that's a very good question. And I think the best thing to do, and this is something that I often will suggest to people, is to do a time inventory. And what I mean by that is, find a small group of people that you trust, who you think love you and you love them, and you start talking about this. Because if we try to do this alone, we can fool ourselves, trick ourselves, right? Not be truthful with ourselves about how we, in fact, are managing our lives, managing our time. So what I suggest people do is they take a piece of paper and they sit down and they just sort of calculate based upon day to day, how many minutes, hours, whatever, do you spend in the course of a day doing X, Y, and Z, and then just list them. And then start sort of adding up over, say, if you're doing this 2 hours a day, like some people will spend easily an hour or two on TikTok. And they'll do that every day. And then you say, okay, now let's multiply that by the week, by the month, by the year. And then let's sort of translate that across a decade. And what happens when you do that exercise is you become horrified when you realize that out of a 20-year span, you've maybe spent 3 years watching TikTok. And then you ask them, is TikTok making you feel better about your relationships, about the people you're with, about yourself? And most people will tell you, no, it's not making me feel better, but we're distracted or we're bored or we're numb. And so what you have to do then is once you do an inventory like this and you come to the collective realization that you're spending a good bit of time doing things that you know are not bringing you joy, that are not giving you opportunities for intimacy with others, then you can go into the next question, which is, well, what would it take to change? And again, I recommend not doing this or trying to do this by yourself, right? But what if you said, okay, what I really want is I want to have good relationships. I want to have good conversations. I want to have opportunities for creativity, because we know that creativity is something that many people become very interested in because they're tired of being just passive consumers, purchasing whatever it is somebody tells them they have to have. And it can be daunting, right? I mean, even cooking, right? There's lots of cooking shows and they are intimidating because you're expected to do, amazing things with your kitchen. But I think if a community of people, a small group of friends, for instance, says, let's just get together once a week, not grow, but well, maybe grow too, but let's just cook a meal together and enjoy it and spend the evening doing it. The experience, right? It's not just thinking about it. It's the experience of doing it and being merciful with each other in that context that then becomes transformative. Because I have yet to find someone to be in a kitchen who maybe felt totally out of place, totally incompetent, but upon being invited into a space, finding out how much pleasure is to be gained by participating in a process that results in food that you then eat with your friends. That's a beautiful thing. And it's very hard to argue against that experience. So that's sort of what I'd recommend.
Ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ τον καθηγητή Νόρμαν.
Much, Professor, for your excellent presentation and for your presence here at the conference. We will conclude for today this session.